Sometimes the cruelest words come from those who should know better, and Martha Sullivan had heard them all her life. In the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, folks whispered warnings about the heavy-set woman who ran the general store, calling her unworthy of any man's attention. But when Jacob Bear McKinnon, the mountain man from the high peaks, rode into town, he didn't listen to their harsh judgment. He saw her gentle heart and quiet strength that everyone else missed. While the townspeople mocked her, Bear chose her above all others. What happens when two lonely souls find love, where society says it shouldn't exist? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalk of Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1873. Dust motes danced in the golden light that filtered through the windows of Sullivan's general store, where Martha carefully arranged bolts of fabric on the wooden counter. Her worn apron, faded from countless washings, bore the stains of honest work and the weight of 28 years of enduring whispers that followed her every step. Martha moved with practiced efficiency through her domain, straightening canned goods and checking inventory with the precision of someone who had learned early that perfection in small things might earn her a measure of peace from the world's judgment. The store smelled of leather, coffee beans, and the lavender soap she made herself, simple pleasures that brought comfort to her otherwise solitary existence. Cedar Ridge had grown from a mining camp to a proper town over the past decade, complete with a church, a school, and enough civilized folks to make cruelty an art form. The buildings lined the main street like weathered soldiers, their false fronts hiding the simple truth that this was still the frontier, where survival mattered more than politeness. Yet somehow the townspeople had found energy to spare for judgment. Morning. "Martha," called Doc Henley as he stepped through the store's entrance, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed at odds with the cool reception most visitors offered her. Dr. Samuel Henley was one of the few souls in Cedar Ridge who treated Martha with genuine kindness, perhaps because his profession had taught him to see beyond surfaces to the pain beneath. "Good morning, Doctor," Martha replied, her voice carrying the soft lilt of someone who chose her words carefully. "How's Mrs. Patterson faring with that cough?" "She'll mend, thanks to that honey and herb mixture you prepared." He paused at the counter, studying her face with the gentle concern that made him beloved by his patients. "You look tired, my dear. Are you sleeping well?" Martha's fingers found the edge of her apron, smoothing it needlessly. "Well enough. Can I help you find something today?" Doc Henley recognized the deflection but didn't press. He'd learned that Martha Sullivan was like a wild creature. Approach too directly and she'd retreat into herself. "Just need some of that good coffee you stock. And perhaps you could spare a few of those peppermint sticks for the Morrison children. Their mother's been poorly, and I thought they might enjoy a small treat." "Of course." Martha moved to gather his requests, her movements economical and sure. As she worked, Doc Henley noticed how she held herself, shoulders slightly hunched, as if expecting a blow. Yet there was dignity in her bearing that no amount of cruel words could diminish. The doctor had been in Cedar Ridge long enough to remember when Martha first arrived, barely 18 and newly orphaned, carrying nothing but a small trunk and the deed to the store her late uncle had left her. He'd watched her transform from a frightened girl into a capable businesswoman, even as the town's opinion of her hardened into something ugly and permanent. The widow Peterson was asking about fabric for a new dress, Doc Henley said, making conversation as Martha wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "I told her you had the finest selection this side of Denver." A small smile flickered across Martha's face. "That's kind of you to say. I do try to stock quality goods. You succeed admirably." He placed coins on the counter, his eyes serious. "Martha, you know you have friends in this town, don't you? Good people who see your worth, regardless of what others might say." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure. But Martha had learned to armor herself against both cruelty and unexpected tenderness. "Thank you, Doctor. That means more than you know." As Doc Henley left, Martha returned to her tasks, each movement a small act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to diminish her. She had built a life here through sheer will and careful savings, creating order and beauty in her small corner of the frontier. The store was her refuge, her sanctuary, and her prison all at once, 20 miles north, in a cabin perched on the edge of the timberline, where the air grew thin and the silence stretched like a blessing. Jacob Bear McKinnon knelt beside his stone fireplace, adding kindling to the morning fire. The flames caught and danced, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls of his home. Bear stood slowly, his massive frame unfolding to its full 6'4" height. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and his beard showed threads of silver despite his 35 years. The wilderness had marked him. Scars from bear claws traced pale lines across his forearms, and his hands bore the permanent stains of a man who lived by trap and rifle. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat his most precious possession, a small wooden cross he'd carved during his first winter in the mountains. The wood was smooth from handling, darkened by years of touch during moments of prayer and contemplation. It reminded him daily that even in solitude, he was not alone. Bear's cabin was sparse but comfortable, containing only what a man truly needed. A sturdy bed covered with furs he'd trapped himself, a table and 2 chairs, the second chair a testament to hope rather than necessity, shelves lined with books rescued from his former life, and cooking implements that had served him well through 7 Montana winters. The morning ritual was always the same: tend the fire, check his traps, read a passage from the worn Bible his mother had given him before he'd left home so many years ago. Today, however, his supplies were running low, which meant a journey to Cedar Ridge, a necessary evil that came with living so far from civilization. Bear gathered his pelts and prepared for the day's journey, loading his pack horse with the furs that would buy him another month's worth of coffee, flour, and the few other luxuries that made winter bearable. The ride to town always stirred complicated feelings in him. The need for supplies warred with his distaste for the company of others. In his younger days, before the war had shown him too much of what men could do to each other, Bear had been sociable enough. But 4 years of fighting for the Union Army had changed him, left him with memories that visited him in dreams and a preference for the honest company of mountains and wildlife over the complicated cruelties of human society. The trail to Cedar Ridge wound through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves and needles creating a carpet of gold and green beneath his horse's hooves. Bear rode in comfortable silence, occasionally stopping to examine tracks or study the movement of game. This was his world, clean, predictable, governed by natural laws rather than the arbitrary cruelties of civilization. As he crested the final hill before Cedar Ridge came into view, Bear paused to study the town spread below him. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could make out the small figures of people going about their business. From this distance it looked peaceful enough, but Bear knew better. Towns had a way of concentrating human nature, both good and bad. Until the bad often overwhelmed the good, he touched the wooden cross in his pocket. A habit formed over years of seeking guidance in difficult moments, and urged his horse forward down the hill. He had business to conduct, supplies to buy, and if fortune smiled on him, he'd be back in his cabin before the sun reached its zenith. Bear had no way of knowing that this trip to Cedar Ridge would be different from all the others, that destiny waited for him in the form of a kind-hearted woman who had endured more judgment than any soul deserved. He rode toward town thinking of coffee and flour, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The mountains behind him stood silent and eternal, witnesses to the beginning of a story that would challenge everything both he and Martha thought they knew about love, courage, and the price of living authentically in a world that demanded conformity above all else. The Cedar Ridge Community Hall buzzed with conversation and the rustle of Sunday best dresses as the monthly social gathering reached its peak. Martha stood near the refreshment table, ladling punch into cups with steady hands, despite the familiar ache in her chest. She had attended these gatherings for 10 years, always helping with the food, always standing at the edges, always hoping this time might be different. In her mother's trunk back home lay a torn wedding dress, ivory silk, that had yellowed with age and disappointment. Her mother had worn it once, on a day filled with promise, before consumption took her just 5 years into marriage. Martha had carefully preserved it through the years, mending the tears that time and hope deferred had created, holding on to the dream that someday she might wear it herself. Tonight, she wore her best blue dress, the one that flattered her figure as much as any garment could, and had even pinned her brown hair up in the style she'd seen in the ladies' magazines. For a brief moment that morning, looking in her mirror, she had allowed herself to imagine that perhaps tonight someone might see past her size to the woman beneath. "Look at her. I'm putting on airs," whispered Mrs. Hartwell to her companion, their voices carrying farther than they intended. As if fancy hair and a pressed dress could change what everyone knows. Martha's hand trembled slightly as she continued serving, but her smile never wavered. She had learned to wear composure like armor, to move through these social rituals with grace even when the words cut deep. The children, at least, treated her with honest affection, and she found comfort in their uncomplicated acceptance. "Miss Martha, this punch is wonderful," young Tommy Morrison said, offering her his gap-toothed grin. "Ma says you make the best sweets in the whole territory." "Thank you, Tommy. That's very kind." Martha's smile became genuine as she ruffled the boy's hair. Children saw her as she truly was, the woman who always had a piece of candy for scraped knees and patient ears for their troubles. The evening continued with dancing and laughter, though Martha remained at her post by the refreshments. She watched couples whirl around the makeshift dance floor, their faces bright with joy and connection. At 28, she had long since stopped expecting invitations to dance, but the longing never quite faded. William Hatch, Cedar Ridge's self-appointed leader and owner of the largest ranch in the area, approached the refreshment table with his usual swagger. A man who had made his fortune through questionable land deals and intimidation, Hatch enjoyed his position as the town's most influential citizen, his pale eyes fixed on Martha with the cold calculation of a man who took pleasure in others' discomfort. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying across the immediate area, "I must say, you've outdone yourself with these refreshments. Though I suppose when a woman has no other prospects, she might as well perfect her domestic skills." The conversations around them gradually quieted as people sensed the coming entertainment. Martha felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm glad you're enjoying them, Mr. Hatch." "Oh, I am indeed. Though I can't help but wonder why you continue to attend these social gatherings. Surely a woman of your situation might find better uses for her time." The cruelty was delivered with a smile, wrapped in the veneer of polite society, but its intent was unmistakable. Martha felt the familiar shrinking sensation, the instinct to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less of a target. "Perhaps," Hatch continued, warming to his audience, "we should establish a separate social hour for those who don't quite fit with proper society. Save everyone the discomfort." A few people laughed, not kindly, but with the nervous energy of those grateful not to be the target. Martha gripped the ladle tighter, her knuckles white against the silver handle. "That seems unnecessary," Doc Henley interjected, stepping closer to the table. "Miss Sullivan contributes more to this community than most." Hatch's smile turned predatory. "Ah, good doctor, always the champion of lost causes. Though I wonder what Mrs. Henley thinks of your special attention to certain members of our community." The implication hung in the air like smoke, designed to embarrass both Martha and the doctor. Martha felt her composure finally cracking, tears threatening to spill, despite her years of practice at enduring public humiliation. That was when the hall's doors opened with enough force to make them bang against the walls. Jacob McKinnon stood silhouetted in the doorway, his massive frame filling the entrance completely. He wore his cleanest buckskins and had obviously made an effort to tame his hair and beard, though the wilderness still clung to him like a second skin. In his hand, he carried a small bundle wrapped in leather. The hall fell silent. Bear McKinnon was known by reputation rather than regular contact. The mountain man, who came to town perhaps 4 times a year, conducted his business with quiet efficiency and disappeared back into the high country. Some claimed he was dangerous, others that he was half wild, but most simply ignored him as an oddity of frontier life. Bear's dark eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the sharp awareness of a man accustomed to reading dangerous situations. His gaze lingered on Martha's face, noting the bright spots of color on her cheeks and the unshed tears she fought to contain. "Excuse the interruption," Bear said, his deep voice carrying easily through the silence. "I was told there was a social gathering tonight." Hatch recovered first, his politician's instincts kicking in. "Mr. McKinnon, what an unexpected surprise. Though I'm not sure this is quite your sort of gathering." Bear stepped fully into the hall, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller. "Depends on what sort of gathering it is. If it's the kind where decent folks enjoy each other's company, then it seems exactly my sort." He walked directly to Martha, his boots marking a steady rhythm on the wooden floor. The crowd parted before him, uncertainty clear on their faces. When he reached the refreshment table, he stopped and offered Martha a small bow of his head. "Miss Sullivan, isn't it? I've heard your store stocks the finest goods in the territory." Martha blinked, startled by the direct address and the courtesy in his tone. "Yes, sir. That's kind of you to say. I wonder if I might trouble you for some of that punch. The ride from the mountains works up quite a thirst." With shaking hands, Martha ladled punch into a cup and offered it to him. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and she was surprised by the gentleness of his touch. "Thank you kindly." Bear sipped the punch and nodded approvingly. "That's excellent. You made this yourself?" "Yes, sir. It's my grandmother's recipe." "She taught you well." Bear's eyes swept the room again, taking in Hatch's scowl and the curious faces of the other townspeople. "Seems like a pleasant gathering. Folks getting to know each other better, sharing good food and conversation." The pointed nature of his comment wasn't lost on anyone present. Bear took another sip of punch and unwrapped the leather bundle he'd been carrying, revealing what appeared to be a small wooden figurine. "I carved this during the long winter evenings," he said to Martha, placing the figurine on the table beside her. It was a delicate bird in flight, wings spread wide, carved with remarkable detail and skill. "Thought you might appreciate it, given how you've built such a fine nest here in town with your store." Martha stared at the gift, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. I can't accept this. It's too fine." "Already carved it," Bear said simply. "Can't uncarve it. Besides, it needs a good home where it'll be appreciated." Hatch stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and something else, perhaps recognition that his carefully orchestrated humiliation had been interrupted by an inconvenient display of genuine decency. "How touching," Hatch said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Though I'm surprised to see you taking such interest in our local oddities, McKinnon." Bear turned slowly to face Hatch, and something in his expression made several people step back. The mountain man had faced down grizzly bears and survived 4 years of Civil War combat, and those experiences had left their mark. Oddities. Bear's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm. "I'm not sure I follow your meaning, Hatch." "Oh, I think you do. We all have our place in the natural order of things. Some folks are meant for certain situations, while others are better suited to different circumstances." Bear considered this for a long moment, his gaze never leaving Hatch's face. "I've spent considerable time studying the natural order living up in those mountains. And one thing I've learned is that the creatures with the loudest roars are usually the most frightened." The insult landed with surgical precision, and Hatch's face darkened further. "I'm not sure a man who lives like a hermit is qualified to judge civilized society." "Maybe not," Bear agreed. "But I know enough to recognize quality when I see it." He turned back to Martha, his expression softening. "Miss Sullivan, would you do me the honor of a dance?" The request sent a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. Martha's eyes widened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. No one had asked her to dance in more years than she cared to count. I'm not much of a dancer," she whispered. "Neither am I," Bear admitted with a slight smile. "But the music's playing and it seems a shame to waste it." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Martha placed her hand on it. The crowd parted as Bear led her to the center of the room, conversations resuming in hushed, urgent tones. The fiddle player, perhaps sensing the moment's significance, began a gentle waltz. Bear placed one large hand carefully on Martha's waist and took her other hand in his. She was surprised to discover he actually could dance, guiding her through the steps with unexpected grace. "Don't mind them," Bear said quietly as they moved together. "Folks who need to hurt others to feel better about themselves aren't worth your worry." Martha looked up into his dark eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, genuine kindness, free of pity or calculation. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve better than their poison," he said simply. "And because I wanted to?" They danced in relative silence, the only sounds the music and the whispered conversations around them. Martha felt as if she were in a dream, moving through space with a man who saw her as worthy of courtesy and respect. When the song ended, Bear released her with the same careful courtesy he'd shown throughout. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Sullivan, and for the punch." He retrieved his hat from where he'd set it on a nearby chair and placed it on his head. "Good evening, folks. Thank you for the hospitality." As Bear walked toward the door, Martha found her voice. "Mr. McKinnon?" He turned back to her. "Thank you for the gift and for—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for what he'd given her. "No need for thanks," Bear said. "Just treating you the way any decent person should be treated." He left then, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he'd appeared. Martha stood holding the wooden bird, acutely aware of every eye in the room focused on her. The whispers would start immediately, she knew, but for once she didn't care. For the first time in years, someone had seen her as worth defending. The evening continued around her, but Martha felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. She touched the wooden bird gently, marveling at the intricate detail of its carved feathers. Somewhere in the high country, a man had spent winter evenings creating something beautiful, and he had given it to her. As the social began to wind down, Martha helped clean up with her usual efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed every moment of her interaction with Bear, from his unexpected arrival to his request for a dance, to the way he'd stood up to Hatch without raising his voice or losing his temper. The torn wedding dress waiting in her trunk no longer seemed like such an impossible dream. 3 days after the social, Martha was arranging new bolts of fabric when the bell above her door chimed with its familiar welcome. She looked up, expecting to see one of her regular customers, and felt her heart skip when she saw Jacob McKinnon's imposing frame filling her doorway. "Good morning, Miss Sullivan," Bear said, removing his hat as he entered. Sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and Martha noticed he'd taken extra care with his appearance since the social. "Good morning, Mr. McKinnon," Martha replied, her hands automatically smoothing her apron, a gesture that had become second nature over the years. "How can I help you today?" Bear approached the counter with careful steps, as if mindful of his size in the confined space. From his jacket, he withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly with coins. "I'm in need of some supplies. Coffee beans, if you have them, and perhaps some of that good flour you stock." "Of course." Martha moved to gather his requested items, hyper-aware of his presence in her store. "How much coffee would you like?" £2 should see me through the month." Bear's eyes wandered around the store, taking in the neat organization and the small touches that made it welcoming. Dried flowers in a jar, hand-lettered signs with careful penmanship, shelves arranged with an artist's eye for balance and appeal. As Martha weighed out the coffee beans, she stole glances at him. In the harsh sunlight of her store, she could see the scars that marked his hands and forearms, testimony to a life lived hard in the wilderness. Yet those same hands had carved the delicate bird that now sat on her mantelpiece at home, and had guided her gently through a waltz 3 nights ago. "Your store is well appointed," Bear observed, running his fingers along a bolt of deep blue wool. "You have an eye for quality goods, thank you. I try to stock items that will serve folks well." Martha wrapped his coffee in brown paper with practiced efficiency. "The mountains must be beautiful this time of year." "They are. Aspens are turning gold, and the air has that crisp edge that promises winter's coming." Bear's voice carried genuine affection for his mountain home. "Though it can get lonely up there, especially when the snow flies." Martha paused in her rapping, struck by the admission. She had always assumed that someone who chose such solitude must prefer it completely. "Do you ever think about living closer to town?" Bear considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. There are advantages to being near other folks, easier to get supplies, conversation when a man needs it." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Company of quality people." The words sent warmth through Martha's chest, though she quickly warned herself against reading too much into them. "The mountains seem like they'd suit a man of your temperament." "They do, mostly. But a man can get to thinking too much when he's got nothing but trees and wildlife for company." Bear accepted the wrapped coffee and paid for it, their fingers brushing again as he took the package. "Mind if I ask what brought you to Cedar Ridge?" Martha hesitated, unused to personal questions from customers. "My uncle left me the store when he passed. I was 18 and had nowhere else to go. That's young to be on your own in a place like this. I managed well enough." The defensive note in her voice was automatic, born of years of proving her capability to skeptical townspeople. Bear heard it and nodded approvingly. "I'm sure you did. Takes considerable strength to build what you've built here." The praise, delivered without condescension or surprise, settled something anxious in Martha's chest. Before she could respond, the bell chimed again, and Mrs. Patterson entered with her usual brisk efficiency. "Morning." "Martha," the older woman said, then stopped short when she noticed Bear. "Oh, Mr. McKinnon, ma'am." Bear nodded politely, but made no move to leave immediately. Mrs. Patterson's eyes flicked between Martha and Bear with obvious curiosity. "I hope I'm not interrupting business." "Not at all," Martha said quickly. "Mr. McKinnon was just finishing his purchase." "Actually," Bear said, settling his hat back on his head, "I was wondering if you might have any of those peppermint sticks Doc Henley mentioned. Seems they're popular with the children." Martha blinked in surprise. She couldn't imagine Bear McKinnon having much interaction with children, living as he did in the wilderness. "Of course. How many would you like?" "A dozen should do." As Martha gathered the candy, Mrs. Patterson watched with undisguised interest. Bear's unexpected purchase would be all over town by evening, Martha knew, along with speculation about why the mountain man was suddenly taking interest in children's treats. Planning to spoil someone's young ones? Mrs. Patterson asked with false casualness. "Thought I might share them next time I see some of the children around town," Bear replied easily. "Kids always seem to appreciate a small treat." The answer was perfectly reasonable, but Martha caught something in his tone that suggested there was more to it. She wrapped the peppermint sticks carefully and added them to his purchases. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said, meaning it. Bear's eyes met hers again, and for a moment the store felt smaller, more intimate. Some things are worth the thoughtfulness. After he left, Mrs. Patterson wasted no time in moving to the counter. "Well, that was interesting. I've never known Jacob McKinnon to buy candy before." "People change," Martha said mildly, though her heart was still beating faster than normal. "Indeed they do." Mrs. Patterson studied Martha's face with shrewd eyes. "You're looking well lately, dear. There's color in your cheeks." Martha busied herself straightening items that were already perfectly arranged. "Thank you. Is there something I can help you find today?" The deflection worked, and Mrs. Patterson launched into her usual list of needs. But as Martha helped her, she found herself glancing toward the window, wondering if Bear had truly left town, or if she might see him again before he returned to his mountain retreat. Her wondering was answered 2 hours later when Bear reappeared, this time carrying his trapping knife, a well-used tool with a worn leather handle that spoke of years of reliable service. The knife represented his life in the wilderness, his ability to survive and provide for himself in the harshest conditions. "Miss Sullivan," he said, approaching the counter with what might have been nervousness. "I hope you don't mind my returning so soon." "Of course not. Did you forget something?" "Not exactly." Bear shifted his weight, and Martha realized with amazement that this imposing man was actually uncertain about something. "I was wondering if you might join me for coffee at the hotel restaurant. That is, if you can spare the time." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both understood. Martha felt her pulse quicken even as practical concerns crowded her mind. That's very kind, but I should mind the store, of course." "I understand." Bear's expression didn't change, but Martha caught a flicker of disappointment before he carefully masked it. Something in that glimpse of vulnerability made her decision for her. "Though I suppose I could close for an hour." "It's been a slow day." Bear's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "I'd be honored by your company." As Martha reached for her shawl and prepared to close the store, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. For the first time in years, she looked like a woman who had somewhere important to be. The walk to the hotel took only 5 minutes, but Martha was acutely aware of every step. People they passed stared openly, some with curiosity, others with disapproval, and a few with the kind of malicious interest that promised gossip by evening. Bear seemed oblivious to the attention, or perhaps simply indifferent to it. He walked beside her with easy confidence, occasionally commenting on changes to the town since his last visit or asking her opinion about various improvements. "The new church bell has a fine tone," he observed as they passed the white-painted building. "The congregation raised money for it all summer," Martha replied. "They're quite proud of it. They should be. Good craftsmanship deserves recognition." His matter-of-fact praise reminded Martha of his own skill with carving, and she found herself saying, "The bird you gave me is beautiful. I've never seen such fine detail in wood." Bear glanced at her, pleasure evident in his expression. "You have it displayed somewhere?" "On my mantelpiece. It catches the light from the fire in the evenings." They had reached the hotel, and Bear held the door for her with careful courtesy. The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the aroma of good coffee and fresh bread. Several patrons looked up as they entered, conversations pausing as the unusual pair found seats at a corner table. "I hope this doesn't cause you difficulty," Bear said quietly once they were seated. "People talking, I mean." Martha considered lying, offering reassurance that gossip didn't bother her. Instead, she found herself being honest. "It might, but I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think is appropriate." Bear's respect for her answer was evident in his expression. "That takes courage, or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same thing." The coffee arrived strong and hot, and they sat in comfortable near silence for several minutes. Martha found herself studying Bear's face when she thought he wasn't looking. The weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors. The careful way he held his cup to avoid overwhelming the delicate china with his large hands. The intelligence in his dark eyes that belied any notion of him being a simple mountain hermit. "May I ask what brought you to the mountains?" Martha ventured. Bear was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled. "The war," he said simply. 4 years of seeing what men can do to each other changes a person. When it ended, I needed quiet, space to think. The mountains offered both." Martha nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. "My parents died when I was 17. Consumption took them both within 6 months. For a long time after, I couldn't bear the sound of coughing or the smell of the medicines Doc Henley uses." "How did you manage?" "Work mostly, keeping busy, building something useful." She gestured around them. "The store gave me purpose when I couldn't find it elsewhere. It's a fine purpose. You served the community well." The simple acknowledgement meant more to Martha than flowery compliments ever could. Here was a man who understood the value of honest work and the dignity that came from building something worthwhile. They talked for nearly an hour, conversation flowing more easily than Martha had expected. Bear asked thoughtful questions about her business, the challenges of frontier commerce, and her opinions on various matters. In return, he shared carefully chosen stories of mountain life, the beauty of sunrise over snow-covered peaks, the satisfaction of providing for oneself through skill and hard work. the harsh lessons the wilderness taught about self-reliance and respect for nature's power. When they finally rose to leave, Martha felt as if she'd discovered an entirely new side of Cedar Ridge, one where she could sit in a public place and be treated as a woman worthy of a man's time and attention. As Bear walked her back to the store, he said quietly, "I'll be heading back to the mountains tomorrow, but I'll need supplies again in a few weeks." "I'll be here," Martha replied, then added with more boldness than she usually managed, "You're welcome any time, Mr. McKinnon." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "I'd be pleased if you'd call me Jacob." "Jacob," she repeated, liking the sound of his name on her lips. "And I'm Martha." He smiled at that, the expression transforming his stern features. "Martha, a good, strong name." After he left, Martha stood in her store, feeling as if the familiar space had somehow become larger, more filled with possibility. The wooden bird on her mantelpiece at home would have company in her thoughts tonight. The memory of dark eyes that looked at her with interest rather than judgment, and the sound of her name spoken with genuine warmth. Outside, she could see some of the townspeople clustered in small groups, their heads bent together in animated conversation. The gossip about her coffee with Jacob McKinnon would spread quickly through Cedar Ridge. For the first time in her adult life, Martha found she didn't care. 2 weeks passed before Jacob returned to Cedar Ridge. But when he did, he carried more than his usual trading goods. Secured carefully in his saddlebags was a leather-bound book, his grandmother's collection of family recipes, written in her careful German script and translated into English by his mother. The book represented more than cooking instructions. It was a bridge between his isolated life and the possibility of sharing it with someone who might understand its value. Martha was helping elderly Mr. Thompson select fabric for his wife when Jacob's familiar silhouette appeared in her doorway. Her heart performed its now familiar leap, though she kept her expression composed as she finished with her customer. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," Jacob said politely as the older man gathered his purchase. "Please give my regards to your wife." "I will indeed, McKinnon. Good to see you in town again." Mr. Thompson's tone carried genuine warmth, unlike many of the townspeople. He judged a man by his character rather than his circumstances. After Mr. Thompson left, Jacob approached the counter with what Martha was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of careful courtesy. "Good afternoon, Martha. You're looking well." "Thank you, Jacob. How are the mountains treating you?" "Well enough, though I've been thinking it might be time to share them with someone who'd appreciate their beauty." His dark eyes met hers directly. "I was wondering if you might consider taking a ride up to see my cabin. It's not far. We could make the journey in the morning and have you back by evening." The invitation took Martha's breath away. In frontier society, a woman visiting a man's home unchaperoned was a serious step that implied intentions on both sides. Jacob was essentially asking her to trust him not just with her safety, but with her reputation. Martha began, then stopped as the implications settled over her. The townspeople would have opinions, certainly. There would be talk, speculation, perhaps even worse. But as she looked into Jacob's honest face, she realized she was tired of making decisions based on other people's judgment. "I'd like that very much," she said quietly. Relief and pleasure flickered across Jacob's features. "Sunday morning? I could meet you here at dawn, and we'd have the full day." Sunday would be perfect. They arranged the details with the careful attention of two people who understood they were planning more than a simple outing. This would be their first time truly alone together, away from the eyes and ears of Cedar Ridge. And both recognized the significance. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of one of those perfect autumn days that made the frontier seem less harsh and more welcoming. Martha had risen before dawn to prepare, choosing her most practical dress and sturdy boots, but taking care with her hair and adding the small silver brooch that had been her mother's. Jacob arrived precisely at sunrise, leading a gentle mare beside his own horse. "This is Belle," he said, stroking the mare's neck affectionately. "She's sure-footed and patient. Perfect for mountain trails." "She's beautiful," Martha said, approaching the horse with some nervousness. She could ride, but it had been years since she'd had occasion to do so. Jacob seemed to sense her uncertainty. Bells carried plenty of nervous riders. "She'll take good care of you." He helped Martha mount with careful hands, ensuring she was secure before swinging easily onto his own horse. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, Martha caught sight of several faces peering from windows, watching their departure with undisguised curiosity. "Second thoughts?" Jacob asked, noticing her glance back at the town. "No," Martha said firmly. No second thoughts. The trail to Jacob's cabin wound through some of the most beautiful country Martha had ever seen. Aspen groves shimmered gold in the morning light, their leaves creating a rustling symphony overhead. Clear streams crossed their path, the water so pure Martha could see every stone on the bottom. The air itself seemed different here, cleaner, sharper, filled with the scent of pine and the promise of coming winter. "It's magnificent." Martha breathed as they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. "Wait until you see the view from my cabin," Jacob said, pleasure evident in his voice. "It overlooks the whole range." They rode in comfortable silence, punctuated by Jacob's occasional commentary about the wildlife, the changing seasons, or the history of particular landmarks. Martha found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait and the peaceful isolation of the mountain trails. "There," Jacob said finally, pointing ahead to where smoke rose from a chimney nestled among tall pines. "Home!" Martha's first sight of Jacob's cabin exceeded her expectations. Rather than the rough shack she'd imagined, it was a well-built log structure with real glass windows, a stone chimney, and a covered porch that looked out over a meadow where a small stream meandered between wildflowers. The setting was so beautiful it took her breath away. "Jacob, it's wonderful," she said as he helped her dismount. "You built this yourself." "Took 3 summers, working between trapping seasons." Pride colored his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had created something worthwhile with his own hands. "Come inside. I'll start coffee." The interior of the cabin was as impressive as the exterior. Rough-hewn walls had been smoothed and fitted with precise craftsmanship. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and sitting areas, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind seeking continued learning. Everything was clean, organized, and surprisingly comfortable. "You have more books than the town library," Martha observed, running her fingers along the spines of well-worn volumes. "Reading helps pass the winter evenings," Jacob said as he built up the fire and set coffee to brew. "I've got philosophy, history, some poetry, and practical books about farming, animal husbandry, that sort of thing." Martha paused at a collection of Shakespeare. "You read poetry?" "Among other things." "A man needs food for his mind as well as his body." Jacob's tone was matter-of-fact, without defensiveness about his intellectual pursuits. As coffee brewed, Jacob showed Martha around the cabin with obvious pride. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a large bed covered in furs and blankets. A smaller room served as a workshop where he carved and repaired tools. The kitchen area included a root cellar stocked with preserved foods and a pantry that spoke of careful planning and self-sufficiency. "You've thought of everything," Martha said admiringly. "It's completely self-contained, has to be. Winter up here can last 6 months, and sometimes the trails are impassable for weeks at a time." Jacob poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to Martha. "But I've been thinking lately that self-sufficiency isn't the same thing as completeness." They settled on the porch with their coffee, looking out over the magnificent view. The silence was peaceful rather than awkward, filled with the sounds of nature. Bird calls, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the stream. "What do you miss most about living in town?" Martha asked eventually. Jacob considered the question seriously. "Conversation, mainly. Someone to share thoughts with, to talk through ideas, or just enjoy companionable silence." He glanced at her. "Company that improves a place rather than simply filling it." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest at the implied compliment. "What about church? Community gatherings?" "I have my own relationship with God," Jacob said, touching the wooden cross in his pocket. "As for community," he shrugged, Most folks in town see me as an oddity at best, a potential danger at worst. Not much community in that. I understand that feeling, Martha said quietly. I know you do. That's part of why I wanted you to see this place. Jacob's voice grew more serious. Martha, I want you to know that my interest in you isn't charity or pity. I see a woman of strength, intelligence, and genuine kindness. The fact that others are too blind to see those qualities says nothing about you and everything about them. The honesty in his words brought tears to Martha's eyes. Jacob, let me finish, he said gently. I know I'm not much of a catch by conventional standards. I live like a hermit. I have little money, and my social graces are rusty from disuse. But I can offer you honesty, respect, and devotion. If that's something you might want. Martha set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. No one had ever spoken to her with such direct sincerity about feelings and intentions. I've never had anyone see me the way you seem to. Then they weren't looking hard enough. They spent the afternoon walking the meadow, with Jacob showing Martha the stream where he collected water, the garden where he grew vegetables, and the small barn where he kept his horses during winter. He pointed out animal tracks, identified bird calls, and shared the rhythms of mountain life with obvious love for his chosen home. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jacob led Martha back to the cabin, where he began preparing a simple meal. From his grandmother's recipe book, he selected a recipe for venison stew that had sustained his family through many harsh winters. My grandmother brought these recipes from Germany, he explained, showing Martha the careful handwriting. My mother translated them and added her own notes. It's one of the few things I have left from my family. Martha studied the book with reverence, understanding the trust Jacob was showing her. The recipes represented generations of family wisdom passed down through women who had made homes in difficult places. That he would share this intimate piece of his heritage spoke volumes about his feelings. Would you teach me to make the stew? Martha asked. I'd like to learn something your family treasured. Jacob's smile was radiant. I'd be honored to share it with you. They worked together in the small kitchen, Jacob explaining the techniques his grandmother had perfected while Martha helped prepare vegetables and season the meat. The domestic intimacy of cooking together felt natural, as if they'd been sharing such moments for years rather than hours. You've made this place into a real home, Martha observed as they waited for the stew to simmer. It's not just shelter, it's a sanctuary. It became that over time, Jacob agreed. But lately, I've been thinking it's incomplete without someone to share it with. As evening approached and they prepared for the ride back to town, Martha felt a profound reluctance to leave. The cabin had shown her a different way of living, one based on simplicity, self-reliance, and connection to the natural world. More importantly, it had shown her a man whose exterior roughness concealed depths of gentleness and wisdom. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said, as Jacob helped her mount Belle for the return journey. It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Thank you for seeing it with fresh eyes, Jacob replied. It means more than you know to have someone appreciate what I've built here. The ride back to town was bittersweet, each mile taking them closer to the complications and judgments of civilization. As Cedar Ridge's lights came into view, both riders slowed their horses, reluctant to end the perfect day. Martha, Jacob said as they reached the outskirts of town, would you consider allowing me to call on you regularly? Properly, I mean. With intentions, Martha's heart raced at the formal request. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I'd like that very much. Jacob dismounted and helped her down from Belle, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then I'll see you soon. Very soon. As Martha walked to her small house behind the store, she carried with her the memory of the most perfect day she'd ever experienced. The recipe book had shown her Jacob's trust, the cabin had revealed his capabilities, and his proposal to court her had offered hope for a future she'd never dared imagine. That night, as she sat by her fire, looking at the wooden bird Jacob had carved, Martha allowed herself to dream of morning coffee shared on a mountain porch and evenings spent reading by firelight with a man who saw her worth. The silver locket had belonged to Martha's mother, passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter for 3 generations. Inside its delicate casing was a tiny photograph of her parents on their wedding day, their faces bright with hope and love. Martha wore it close to her heart, a reminder of the belonging and acceptance she'd lost when consumption took her family, and a symbol of her deep longing to create that sense of home again. 3 weeks had passed since her visit to Jacob's mountain cabin, and he had kept his promise to call on her regularly. Every few days he appeared at her store, sometimes with the excuse of needing supplies, other times simply to share coffee and conversation. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had taken notice, and their reactions ranged from curious whispers to outright hostility. "It's becoming quite the scandal," Mrs. Hartwell announced loudly as she entered the store, her voice pitched to carry to the other customers browsing the shelves. "A respectable woman simply doesn't entertain men in such a familiar manner." Martha continued folding fabric with steady hands, though she felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell. How can I help you today?" "You can help by conducting yourself with more propriety," the older woman sniffed. "That mountain man has been seen coming and going from your store at all hours. People are beginning to talk. Mr. McKinnon is a customer like anyone else," Martha replied evenly. "I treat all my customers with courtesy. Courtesy is one thing. What you're doing is quite another." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Mark my words, young lady, no good will come of encouraging such unsuitable attention." After Mrs. Hartwell left with her purchases, Martha found herself gripping the silver locket through her dress, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The criticism stung because it echoed her own fears, that perhaps she was foolish to believe a man like Jacob could truly care for her, that the townspeople might be right about her unsuitability for decent society. The bell chimed again, and Martha looked up to see William Hatch entering with his usual air of self-importance. Behind him walked 2 men she didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers with cold eyes and an air of barely contained violence. "Miss Sullivan," Hatch said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "I'd like you to meet some business associates of mine, Mr. Crawford and Mr. Pike from Denver." The 2 men nodded curtly, but said nothing. Martha felt unease crawl up her spine at their presence. "Gentlemen, this is the establishment I was telling you about," Hatch continued, gesturing around the store. "Prime location, excellent foot traffic. Of course, it would need some improvements to reach its full potential." "Mr. Hatch," Martha said carefully, "is there something specific I can help you with today?" "Actually, yes. I have a proposition for you." Hatch moved closer to the counter, his pale eyes fixed on her face. "I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for your store. Enough money to set you up comfortably somewhere else, perhaps back east, where you might find society more accommodating to your particular circumstances." Martha's blood ran cold. "My store isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price." Crawford spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat menace of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Question is whether you're smart enough to take the easy money, or if we have to make things difficult." "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Martha said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This store belongs to me, and I have no intention of selling." Hatch's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his eyes. "Of course, you'll want time to consider, but I should mention that I've heard some disturbing rumors about your association with that mountain hermit. People are beginning to question whether someone who shows such poor judgment in personal matters can be trusted in business dealings." The threat was clear, though couched in polite language. Martha felt her world shifting beneath her feet as she realized the extent of Hatch's influence and the lengths he might go to acquire what he wanted. "Think about it," Hatch said as he turned to leave. "Cedar Ridge is a small town. Reputation matters here. It would be a shame if yours were to suffer irreparable damage over poor choices in companionship." After they left, Martha sank onto the stool behind her counter, her hands shaking. The locket felt heavy against her chest, a reminder of all she'd already lost and the very real possibility that she might lose everything again. That evening, as Martha closed her store and prepared to walk to her small house, she found Jacob waiting by her door. His presence, which had become a source of comfort over the past weeks, now filled her with conflicting emotions. "You look troubled," Jacob observed, his dark eyes studying her face with concern. "What's happened?" Martha hesitated, torn between her desire to confide in him and her fear of dragging him into her troubles. "William Hatch paid me a visit today. He wants to buy my store," Jacob's expression darkened. "And when you refused?" "He suggested my reputation might suffer if I continued to associate with unsuitable companions." Martha couldn't meet his eyes as she spoke. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, understanding flooding his features. "You're worried about what people will say, about what being seen with me might cost you." "I'm worried about losing everything I've worked for," Martha said, the words coming out more harshly than she intended. "This store is all I have, Jacob. It's my home, my livelihood, my independence. If Hatch can turn the whole town against me, then you think it might be better if I stayed away." The pain in his voice cut through Martha's fear and uncertainty. She looked up to see hurt and resignation warring in his expression and realized how her words must have sounded. "No," she said quickly, "that's not what I want. But I'm frightened, Jacob. Hatch has power in this town, and he's not going to give up easily." Jacob stepped closer, his large hands gentle as they cupped her face. "Martha, listen to me. Men like Hatch prey on fear. The more you give in to their threats, the stronger they become. Easy words when it's not your livelihood at stake, isn't it?" Jacob's voice was quiet but intense. "You think I don't have anything to lose? You think my feelings for you don't put me at risk too?" Martha felt tears threaten as the full weight of their situation settled over her. They were both outcasts in their own ways, both vulnerable to the town's judgment and Hatch's machinations. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "We're going to stand together," Jacob said firmly. "We're going to refuse to let fear dictate our choices, and we're going to trust that doing what's right will see us through." That night, alone in her small house, Martha sat by her fire, holding the silver locket and thinking about courage. Her parents had been brave enough to love each other, despite their family's disapproval. Her mother had been brave enough to marry a poor farmer and make a life on the frontier. Perhaps it was time for Martha to find her own courage. The next morning brought fresh challenges. When Martha opened her store, she found several of her regular customers conspicuously absent. Those who did come seemed uncomfortable, conducting their business quickly and avoiding conversation. By afternoon, it was clear that Hatch's influence was already at work. Mrs. Thompson, one of Martha's most loyal customers, entered the store looking distressed. "Martha, dear, I'm so sorry, but my husband says I shouldn't shop here anymore. He's heard rumors about your situation, and he's concerned about our family's reputation." "I understand," Martha said quietly, though each word felt like a physical blow. "I don't like it," Mrs. Thompson continued, tears in her eyes. "You've always been good to us, and it doesn't seem right. But Harold's afraid Mr. Hatch might make trouble for our business if we're seen supporting you." After Mrs. Thompson left, Martha stood alone in her store, feeling the walls closing in around her. The afternoon brought only 2 more customers, both making hurried purchases without their usual friendly conversation. As evening approached, Martha found herself facing a terrible choice. She could end her association with Jacob and hope to salvage her business and reputation, or she could stand firm in her feelings and risk losing everything she'd worked to build. The silver locket seemed to pulse against her chest, reminding her of her parents' love and the courage it had taken for them to choose each other over social expectations. Perhaps that was the real inheritance they'd left her, not the locket itself, but the example of love strong enough to overcome convention. When Jacob appeared at her door that evening, Martha was ready with her answer. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice stronger than she'd felt all day. "About standing together and not letting fear make our decisions." Jacob waited. Hope and uncertainty mingled in his expression. If Hatch wants a fight, Martha continued, then perhaps it's time to give him one. But I need to know that whatever comes, we'll face it together. Jacob's smile was answer enough, but his words sealed their pact. Together, he promised. Whatever comes, we'll meet it together. As they stood in her doorway, Martha touched the silver locket one more time and felt her parents' approval. Love, she realized, always required courage. The question was whether she and Jacob had enough courage between them to see this through to the end. The October wind carried the scent of coming winter as Jacob sat on his porch, cleaning his father's rifle with methodical precision. The weapon was a reminder of a heritage he'd tried to leave behind. 3 generations of McKinnon men who had solved their problems with violence when words failed. The rifle had served his father in the Indian Wars, and Jacob had carried it through 4 years of Civil War carnage, from Bull Run to Appomattox. Now it lay across his knees like a weight of accumulated sin, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Martha was due to arrive within the hour for her second visit to his cabin, and Jacob found himself wrestling with a decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. She deserved to know the truth about his past, about the man she was allowing herself to care for. The mountain hermit she'd come to know was only part of the story, the part he'd carefully constructed to hide from the darker chapters of his life. The sound of approaching horses broke his reverie. Martha appeared through the trees, riding Belle with growing confidence, her face bright with the pleasure of the mountain journey. Behind her rode Doc Henley, whom Jacob had invited to join them for reasons that would become clear soon enough. "Good afternoon, Jacob," Martha called as she dismounted. "Dr. Henley was kind enough to accompany me when I mentioned I was riding up to see you, Doc." Jacob nodded, setting the rifle aside and rising to greet them. "Thank you for coming. I know it's a long ride from town." Doc Henley studied Jacob's face with the perceptive eyes of a man accustomed to reading pain and hidden truths. "Your message suggested it was important." "It is." Jacob helped Martha down from her horse, noting the way she trusted him completely, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. What he was about to tell her might change all of that. "Let's go inside. I have coffee ready, and we need to talk." They settled around Jacob's simple wooden table, steam rising from their cups in the cool mountain air. Jacob had spent days rehearsing this conversation, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed inadequate to convey the weight of what he needed to share. "Martha," he began carefully, "before we go any further with our understanding, there are things about my past you need to know. Things that might change how you feel about me." Martha set down her coffee cup, concern creasing her features. "Jacob, what is it?" "You know I served in the war. What you don't know is what kind of soldier I was." Jacob's hands tightened around his cup as memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. "I wasn't just a foot soldier or even a regular officer. I was part of a special unit, men who were sent to do things the regular army couldn't officially sanction." Doc Henley leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "What kind of things?" "The kind that keep you awake at night for the rest of your life." Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sabotage behind enemy lines. Assassination of Confederate officers. Raids on civilian targets suspected of supporting the rebellion." Martha's face had gone pale, but she didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. "There was a plantation in Georgia," Jacob continued, the words coming like blood from a wound. "Intelligence suggested the owner was financing Confederate operations, hiding weapons, providing intelligence to rebel forces. My unit was ordered to neutralize the threat." The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines outside. "We went in at night. The plan was simple: destroy the weapons cache, capture or eliminate the owner. Gather any intelligence we could find." Jacob's hands had begun to shake, and he set down his coffee cup to avoid spilling it. "But when we got there, we found more than just the owner." "Jacob," Martha said softly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm despite the pain etched in every line of his face. His family was there. His wife, his daughter. She couldn't have been more than 16. They weren't supposed to be in the house. Intelligence was wrong, or incomplete, or maybe they just didn't care. Doc Henley reached across the table and placed a steadying hand on Jacob's arm. "What happened?" "My commanding officer gave the order to proceed anyway. Said we couldn't risk letting them go, couldn't chance them alerting Confederate forces in the area." Jacob's voice broke on the words. "I followed orders. God help me, I followed orders." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha's eyes filled with tears, though Jacob couldn't tell if they were for his victims or for the pain he was clearly suffering. "How many?" Doc Henley asked gently. "All of them. The owner, his wife, their daughter, and 3 slaves who tried to protect their mistress." Jacob buried his face in his hands. 7 people died that night because I was a good soldier who followed orders without question." Martha rose from her chair and moved around the table to stand beside Jacob. Without hesitation, she placed her hands on his shoulders, offering comfort despite the horror he'd just revealed. "That's why you came to the mountains," she said, understanding flooding her voice. "You were running from what you'd done." "I was trying to find some way to live with it," Jacob corrected. "The mountains don't judge. They don't care about your past sins. They just demand that you survive or die based on your current actions." "But the war ended years ago," Martha said. "Why tell us this now?" Jacob looked up at her, his eyes haunted but resolute. "Because Hatch has been asking questions about me, sending men to dig into my past. If he uncovers what I've just told you, he'll use it to destroy any chance we might have together." Doc Henley nodded grimly. "He'll paint you as a dangerous killer, unfit for civilized society." "Which maybe I am," Jacob said quietly. "Maybe the townspeople are right to fear me. Maybe you should fear me too." Martha's hands tightened on his shoulders. "Do you think I'm in danger from you?" "No." The answer came immediately without hesitation. "I would die before I let harm come to you." "Then I'm not afraid." Martha's voice carried a strength that surprised them all. "What you did in the war, that was war, Jacob. Terrible choices made in terrible circumstances. That doesn't define who you are now, doesn't it? Those people are still dead because of my actions, and how many people have you helped since then? How many animals have you treated with respect instead of slaughter? How much kindness have you shown to someone the whole town has written off as worthless?" Martha moved to kneel beside his chair, her eyes level with his. "The man who carved me a wooden bird and asked me to dance, that's who you are now." Doc Henley cleared his throat softly. "Martha's right, Jacob. I've seen plenty of men who came back from that war carrying burdens like yours. The ones who let it consume them became bitter, violent, dangerous. The ones who found ways to live with it, to build something better from the ashes, those are the ones worth knowing. But if Hatch makes this public, then we'll deal with it," Martha said firmly. "Together, like we promised." Jacob searched her face for any sign of fear or revulsion, and found only determined compassion. The acceptance he saw there was almost more than he could bear. "There's more," he said reluctantly. "After the war, I spent 2 years drinking myself to death in every saloon between Georgia and Colorado. Did things I'm not proud of, hurt people who didn't deserve it. I was mean, Martha. Dangerous in the way that broken men can be. But you stopped," Doc Henley observed. "Something turned you around." Jacob nodded toward the wooden cross on his mantelpiece. "Found that cross in the ruins of a church I'd helped destroy during the war. Carried it with me for 2 years, hating what it represented, hating what I'd become. One night in Denver, drunk and looking for a fight, I picked on the wrong man, a preacher who proceeded to beat the hell out of me and then nurse me back to health." A ghost of a smile crossed his features at the memory. "Reverend Matthews was about 6 feet tall and tough as rawhide. Told me I had 2 choices. Keep destroying myself and everyone around me, or find a way to build something worthwhile from the wreckage of my life. So you came to the mountains," Martha said. "Built the cabin, learned to live with myself, tried to find some kind of peace." Jacob looked directly at Martha. "But peace isn't the same as happiness. I didn't know what happiness was until I met you." Martha felt tears overflow and run down her cheeks. "Oh, Jacob, I needed you to know all of this before we go any further," Jacob said. "If Hatch exposes my past, it won't just be gossip and social pressure we're facing. He'll paint me as a threat to the community, a danger to decent folks. And anyone associated with me will be painted with the same brush," Martha finished. "I understand." Doc Henley stood and moved to the window, looking out at the peaceful mountain vista. "There's something else you should know," he said quietly. "Hatch isn't just interested in your store, Martha. He's been buying up property all over the valley, usually after the owners face some kind of crisis that forces them to sell." "What kind of crisis?" Martha asked. "The Hendersons lost their farm after their barn mysteriously burned down. The Petersons sold out after their wells were poisoned. The Williams family left town after their daughter was attacked by unknown assailants." Doc Henley turned back to face them. "I've been keeping track, and there's a pattern. Hatch makes an offer, the owner refuses, then something terrible happens that forces their hand." Jacob's expression darkened. "You think he's behind all of it?" "I can't prove it, but yes." "And those men he brought to your store, Martha, Crawford and Pike, they have reputations. Violent ones. The implications settled over them like a shroud. They weren't just facing social pressure and economic threats. They were dealing with a man who would use violence to achieve his goals. All the more reason to stand firm," Martha said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "If we give in to him now, he'll just move on to his next victim." Jacob stood and retrieved his father's rifle from where he'd set it aside. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, despite his years of peaceful mountain living. "I hoped I'd never have to use this again," he said quietly. "But it seems the war isn't quite over for me after all." Martha watched him handle the rifle with practiced ease and felt a chill of premonition. The gentle mountain man she'd fallen in love with was showing her another side of himself, the soldier who had survived 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in American history. "Promise me something," she said urgently. "Promise me you won't let this turn you back into what you were during the war." Jacob met her eyes, understanding her fear. "I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you without becoming a monster again. But Martha, if it comes down to your safety or my soul, I'll choose your safety every time." The admission terrified and comforted her in equal measure. As they prepared to return to town that evening, Martha carried with her the full knowledge of who Jacob McKinnon truly was. Not just the gentle hermit or the skilled craftsman, but the trained killer who would do anything to protect the people he loved. The question that haunted her as they rode down the mountain trail was whether love could truly redeem a man's darkest deeds, or whether some sins were too heavy for even the strongest heart to bear. The forged property deed lay spread across Doc Henley's kitchen table like a cancer, its false promises of legitimacy written in careful script that mimicked official government documents. Martha stared at the papers with growing horror, realizing that her fight with William Hatch was about more than just her store or her relationship with Jacob. It was part of a systematic theft that had been robbing honest families of their land for years. "Where did you get this?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Doc Henley adjusted his spectacles and pointed to the official-looking seals and signatures. "Tommy Morrison found it in Hatch's office when he was delivering medicine to one of Hatch's men who'd been injured. The boy's got quick eyes and a good memory. He saw this on Hatch's desk and memorized enough details that I was able to piece together what it represented." Jacob leaned over the table, his expression grim as he studied the document. "This claims ownership of the lot where Martha's store sits, dated 2 years before her uncle's death." "Exactly. If this document were genuine, it would mean Hatch owned the land before Martha's uncle ever established his claim. It would invalidate her inheritance and give Hatch legal grounds to seize the property." Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "But it's not real, is it? My uncle's deed is legitimate. I have the original documents filed with the territorial government." "Your uncle's deed is absolutely legitimate," Doc Henley assured her. "But that's not the point. Hatch doesn't need his forgery to be perfect. He just needs it to be convincing enough to create doubt in court. With his political connections and financial resources, he could tie up your property rights for years while the matter is investigated. And in the meantime," Jacob said, understanding flooding his voice. Martha loses her livelihood and is forced to sell. Precisely. It's the same pattern he's used throughout the valley, just with different methods each time. Doc Henley rolled up the document carefully. The Hendersons, the Petersons, the Williams family, they all fell victim to variations of this scheme. Martha sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Hatch's criminal enterprise. How many families has he destroyed? At least a dozen that I know of, probably more. He's been very careful to space out his acquisitions and vary his methods so no one would notice the pattern. Doc Henley's voice carried years of suppressed anger. I've been trying to gather evidence for months, but Hatch is clever. He always maintains plausible deniability. Until now, Jacob said quietly. This document is direct evidence of fraud. It would be if we could prove it was in Hatch's possession. Tommy Morrison is brave, but his word alone wouldn't stand up in court against Hatch's influence. Martha looked up at both men, desperation and determination warring in her expression. Then what do? We can't just let him steal everything from everyone. We need more evidence, Jacob said, his mind already working through possibilities. And we need to find a way to expose him that doesn't rely on the word of a 12-year-old boy against one of the most powerful men in the territory. Doc Henley nodded grimly. The problem is that Hatch keeps most of his incriminating documents in his personal safe. Getting access to them would require breaking and entering, Jacob finished, which would make any evidence we found inadmissible in court. Not necessarily, a new voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley stepping into the kitchen, his weathered face serious but not unfriendly. Evening, folks. Doc, you left your front door unlocked and I saw the lights burning late. Thought I'd check to make sure everything was all right. Martha's heart sank. Sheriff Bradley was one of Hatch's closest allies in town, and his presence here could mean disaster for their plans. Tom, Doc Henley said carefully, this is rather a private matter. I'm sure it is, Bradley replied. But instead of the hostility they expected, his tone carried something that might have been sympathy. Mind if I sit down? I think we need to talk. Jacob tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward where his knife usually hung. The sheriff noticed the movement and raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. Easy, McKinnon. I'm not here to arrest anyone. Truth is, I'm here because I've been watching Hatch's activities for some time now, and I think we might be able to help each other. Doc Henley studied the sheriff's face with sharp eyes. What exactly are you saying, Tom? I'm saying that being sheriff in a town where the most powerful man is a criminal puts a man in a difficult position. Hatch has been very careful to keep me in the dark about his more questionable activities, but I'm not blind. Bradley removed his hat and set it on the table. I've seen the pattern of property acquisitions, the convenient accidents that befall families who refuse to sell. I've just never been able to prove anything. Martha found her voice. Why should we trust you? Because 3 years ago, Hatch tried to force my sister's family off their farm using methods similar to what he's used on others. They were smart enough to sell and leave the territory before anything violent happened, but I've never forgotten. Bradley's eyes hardened. And because I swore an oath to uphold the law, not to look the other way, while influential men break it. Jacob leaned back in his chair, reassessing the situation. What kind of help are you offering? The kind that comes with a badge and legal authority. If we can gather enough evidence to build a solid case against Hatch, I can guarantee it gets to the territorial authorities without interference. Bradley looked at each of them in turn. But I need proof that will stand up in court, not just suspicions and hearsay. Doc Henley made a decision and unrolled the forged deed. Will this help? Bradley studied the document carefully, his expression growing darker as he read. Jesus Christ! Excuse my language, Miss Sullivan, but this is brazenly fraudulent. Where did you get it? They explained Tommy Morrison's discovery, and Bradley nodded thoughtfully. The boy's a good kid with sharp eyes. But you're right that his testimony alone won't be enough to convict someone with Hatch's resources. What would be enough? Martha asked. We need to catch him in the act of using fraudulent documents, or we need to find his cache of forgeries and prove they came from him. Bradley studied the deed again. This particular document is interesting because of the specific language used and the type of ink and paper. If we could find other forgeries that match these characteristics, you think there are more documents like this, Jacob said. I'm certain of it. A scheme this elaborate doesn't work with just one forged deed. Hatch would need multiple documents for each property, false surveys, fake witness statements, backdated contracts. Bradley looked at Martha. The question is whether you're willing to take the risk necessary to expose him. What kind of risk? Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The kind where we use you as bait to draw Hatch into making a mistake that exposes his whole operation. The room fell silent as the implications of Bradley's suggestion sank in. Martha felt fear and determination warring in her chest, while Jacob's expression darkened at the thought of Martha being placed in danger. Absolutely not, Jacob said firmly. I won't have Martha used as bait for a man who's already proven he'll use violence to get what he wants. Jacob, Martha said quietly, if this is the only way to stop him, there has to be another way. Maybe, Bradley said. But every day we wait, Hatch gets stronger and more families suffer. Miss Sullivan, I won't lie to you. There would be real danger involved. But with proper precautions and backup. No, Jacob repeated, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Find another way. Martha looked at the forged deed spread on the table and thought about all the families who had lost their homes and livelihoods to Hatch's schemes. The Hendersons, driven from their farm after their barn burned. The Petersons, forced to abandon wells that had sustained their family for generations. The Williams family, fleeing after their daughter was attacked. I appreciate your concern, Jacob, Martha said carefully, but this isn't just about my store anymore. This is about justice for everyone Hatch has hurt. Justice isn't worth your life. And what kind of life will I have if we let him continue? He'll destroy my business, drive away anyone who supports me, and move on to his next victim. Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting men like Hatch decide my fate. Doc Henley cleared his throat. Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves. Sheriff, what exactly would this plan involve? Bradley leaned forward, his expression serious. Hatch has been pressuring Miss Sullivan to sell. We let him think he's winning. Maybe Martha appears to be reconsidering his offer, suggests she might be willing to negotiate. When he brings out his proof of ownership to pressure her into a quick sale, we're there to witness it and arrest him. With Crawford and Pike backing him up, Jacob pointed out grimly. Armed men who won't hesitate to use violence. Which is why we'd have our own backup, Bradley replied. I've already contacted Deputy Marshal Harrison in Helena. If we can provide him with solid evidence of a federal crime, and land fraud definitely qualifies, he'll come with enough men to handle Hatch's hired guns. Martha felt a spark of hope. When would this happen? Soon. The longer we wait, the more chance Hatch has to discover we're onto him. Bradley rolled up the forged deed and handed it back to Doc Henley. But, Miss Sullivan, I need you to understand the risks. If something goes wrong, if our timing is off, I understand, Martha said firmly. But I also understand that doing nothing guarantees Hatch wins. Jacob stood abruptly and moved to the window, his shoulders tense with frustration. This is madness. We're talking about deliberately provoking a man who's already shown he'll use violence to get what he wants. Jacob, Martha said gently, rising to join him at the window. Look at me. He turned reluctantly, and she saw fear in his dark eyes, not for himself, but for her. You told me once that the mountains taught you to face reality directly, without flinching from hard truths, Martha said. The hard truth is that Hatch won't stop until someone stops him. If we don't act now, he'll keep destroying lives until there's nothing left of the community we both care about. I can't lose you, Jacob said quietly, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Not when I've just found you. Martha reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the worry lines around his eyes. You won't lose me. But I need to know that you trust me to be strong enough for this. Jacob closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. When he opened them again, Martha saw resignation mixed with fierce protectiveness. What do you need me to do? he asked Bradley. Be ready, the sheriff replied. When we spring this trap, it needs to be perfect. When mistaken, Hatch walks away clean, probably with enough warning to destroy any evidence we might have found. They spent the next hour planning, working out details and contingencies with the thoroughness of people who understood that failure meant more than disappointment. It meant Hatch would consolidate his power and become untouchable. As they prepared to leave Doc Henley's house, Bradley pulled Jacob aside. "McKinnon, I know about your war record," the sheriff said quietly. "The official record, anyway. What I need to know is whether you can handle this situation without letting your past turn you into something Martha wouldn't recognize." Jacob considered the question seriously. "I can't promise there won't be violence if Hatch threatens her, but I can promise I'll do everything possible to keep it from going that far." "That's all any of us can promise," Bradley replied. "Just remember, we need Hatch alive and able to stand trial. Dead men can't expose the full scope of their crimes." As Jacob and Martha walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, both lost in thought about what lay ahead, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows near the hotel. Crawford had been keeping an eye on Martha's movements for days, and the late-night meeting at Doc Henley's house was exactly the kind of development Hatch would want to know about immediately. By morning, Hatch would know that his enemies were planning something. The question was whether Martha, Jacob, and their allies could execute their plan before Hatch could counter it. Martha squeezed Jacob's arm as they reached her door. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your cabin, understanding who you really are, they've been the happiest of my life." Jacob pulled her close, holding her against his chest as if he could protect her from the dangers ahead through sheer force of will. "Mine too," he whispered into her hair. "Mine too." Above them the mountain stars shone down with cold indifference, witnesses to a love that was about to be tested by fire. Martha's hands trembled as she lifted her father's shotgun from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom. The weapon had belonged to her father, carried west during the family's migration to the frontier, and it represented the fighting spirit that had sustained the Sullivan family through hardship and loss. She had never expected to need it, but Jacob's patient instruction over the past 3 days had taught her that sometimes survival required preparation for the unthinkable. "Remember what I showed you about the sight picture?" Jacob said quietly as he checked the shotgun's action one final time. "And don't aim unless you're prepared to shoot. A weapon you're not willing to use is worse than no weapon at all." They were in Martha's small parlor, the morning sun casting long shadows through her windows, as they made final preparations for what Sheriff Bradley was calling the most important day in Cedar Ridge's history. Deputy Marshal Harrison had arrived from Helena the previous evening with 3 experienced deputies, and they were positioned around town waiting for Hatch to make his move. "I still don't like this plan," Jacob muttered as he loaded shells into the shotgun's magazine. "Too many things can go wrong." "Everything worth doing involves risk," Martha replied, though her voice carried more confidence than she felt. "And we've planned for every contingency we can think of." The plan was deceptively simple. Martha would send word to Hatch that she was reconsidering his offer for her store, suggesting that recent difficulties with her reputation had made her realize the wisdom of accepting his generous terms. When Hatch arrived with his forged documents to pressure her into an immediate sale, Sheriff Bradley and the federal deputies would be waiting to arrest him for fraud. What made the plan dangerous was the human element, Hatch's unpredictability, the presence of his armed men, and the possibility that desperation might drive him to violence when he realized he'd been trapped. A soft knock at the door interrupted Martha's thoughts. She opened it to find Doc Henley, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grim. "How are you holding up, my dear?" he asked, studying her face with professional concern. "Well enough, considering," Martha replied. "Though I'll be glad when this is over. We all will." Doc Henley set his bag on Martha's kitchen table and began checking its contents. "I've brought supplies for treating wounds, just in case. Let's hope I won't need them." Jacob emerged from the bedroom, his father's rifle in his hands, and his expression set with the hard resolve of a man preparing for battle. "Any word from Bradley?" "Harrison's men are in position," Doc Henley reported. "The marshal himself is hidden in the hotel across the street, and Bradley is making his rounds to avoid suspicion." "Everything's ready." Martha moved to her window and peered through the curtains at the street below. Cedar Ridge looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, with people going about their daily business, unaware of the drama about to unfold. She wondered how many of those people would support her if they knew the truth about Hatch, and how many would side with him regardless of his crimes. "Martha," Jacob said softly, coming to stand beside her, "there's still time to change your mind. We could leave, today, right now. Take the trail to my cabin and let the law handle Hatch without putting you in danger." The temptation was real. Martha could picture herself riding away from Cedar Ridge, leaving behind the store she'd built, the community that had never fully accepted her, and the fight that threatened to destroy everything she'd worked for. But the image of the families Hatch had already destroyed gave her strength. "No," she said firmly. "If we run now, he wins. And he'll keep winning until someone stands up to him." Jacob nodded, though the worry in his eyes remained. "Then we see this through together." A movement in the street caught Martha's attention. William Hatch was approaching her store, flanked by Crawford and Pike. The moment they had been preparing for was at hand. "He's coming," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Jacob immediately moved away from the window, positioning himself where he could see the store's entrance but remain hidden from view. Doc Henley gathered his medical supplies and retreated to the bedroom, ready to provide aid if needed, but safely out of the line of fire. Martha took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and walked to her store to meet her fate. Hatch entered with his usual swagger, but Martha noticed a new tension in his manner. The look of a man who sensed opportunity slipping away and was prepared to take desperate measures to reclaim it. "Miss Sullivan," Hatch said, his voice carrying false warmth, "I received your message. I'm pleased to hear you've reconsidered my generous offer. Circumstances have forced me to be more practical in my thinking," Martha replied, playing her role carefully. "Recent events have made it clear that my position in this community is perhaps not as secure as I believed." Crawford and Pike positioned themselves near the door, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Martha fought to keep her expression neutral, despite the menace their presence represented. "A wise woman adapts to changing circumstances," Hatch agreed. "I trust you're prepared to accept my original terms." "That depends on whether you can provide clear proof of your ownership claims," Martha said, following the script they had rehearsed. "I need to be certain this transaction is legitimate." Hatch's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Of course. I have all the necessary documentation right here." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio containing several official-looking documents. Martha's heart raced as she recognized the forged deed Doc Henley had shown her, along with what appeared to be additional fraudulent papers. "As you can see," Hatch said, spreading the documents on her counter, "my claim to this property predates your uncle's by several years. I've been patient in allowing you to operate here, but recent circumstances require me to assert my legal rights." Martha leaned over the documents, pretending to study them while actually positioning herself to give Sheriff Bradley a clear view through the front window. "These seem to be in order," she said loudly enough for anyone listening outside to hear clearly. "Indeed they are. Now if you'll just sign this bill of sale." "Actually, Mr. Hatch," a new voice interrupted from the doorway, "I think we need to examine those documents more carefully." Sheriff Bradley stepped into the store, his badge visible and his hand resting on his gun. Behind him came Deputy Marshal Harrison, a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to facing down dangerous criminals. Hatch's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Bradley?" "This is a private business transaction." "A business transaction based on fraudulent documents," Harrison said calmly, moving to examine the papers spread on Martha's counter. "Mr. Hatch, You're under arrest for land fraud conspiracy and violation of federal territorial laws. Crawford and Pike immediately reached for their weapons, but Harrison had anticipated their move. I wouldn't do that if I were you, gentlemen. You're outnumbered and outgunned. As if summoned by his words, 3 more federal deputies appeared in the doorway, their rifles trained on Hatch's men. This is outrageous, Hatch sputtered. Those documents are completely legitimate. I demand to see a warrant. Harrison produced a folded paper from his coat. Federal warrant, signed by the territorial judge in Helena. We have testimony and evidence linking you to multiple instances of fraud and intimidation. Testimony from whom? Hatch demanded, his eyes wild with desperation. From the families you've driven from their homes, Martha said, stepping forward with newfound courage. From the people you've threatened and intimidated. From honest citizens who've finally had enough of your crimes. Hatch's gaze fixed on Martha with pure hatred. You think you've won, you fat cow? You think exposing me will change anything? This town will never accept you, no matter what you do. Maybe not, Martha replied calmly. But at least they'll be free to make that choice without fear of what you might do to them. The confrontation might have ended there, with Hatch and his men taken into custody without violence, but Crawford had other ideas. Despite the rifles pointed at him, he made a desperate grab for his gun, perhaps hoping to shoot his way out, or at least take Martha with him. Jacob's rifle barked from the doorway, leading to Martha's living quarters. The bullet, taking Crawford in the shoulder and spinning him around before he could clear his holster. Pike, seeing his partner fall, raised his hands in surrender rather than face the same fate. Good shooting, Harrison said approvingly, as his deputies moved to secure the wounded Crawford and the surrendering Pike. Clean shoulder wound. He'll live to stand trial. Jacob emerged from his hiding place, his father's rifle still ready, but no longer pointed at any immediate threat. I aimed for the shoulder, he said quietly to Martha. I kept my promise not to become a killer again. Martha felt tears of relief and pride well up in her eyes. Jacob had faced the test of violence and emerged still the man she loved, still the man who chose protection over vengeance. As Hatch was led away in shackles, he turned back to Martha one final time. This isn't over, he snarled. I have friends, influence, money. I'll be back. Maybe, Sheriff Bradley said, adjusting the chains that bound Hatch's wrists. But your friends will find it harder to help you from a federal prison, and your influence tends to disappear once people aren't afraid of you anymore. Doc Henley emerged to tend to Crawford's wound, while Deputy Marshal Harrison began cataloguing the forged documents as evidence. The immediate crisis was over, but Martha knew the larger battle for Cedar Ridge's future was just beginning. As the crowd that had gathered outside began to disperse, Martha noticed something that gave her hope. Among the faces watching from the street, she saw more curiosity than condemnation, more interest than hostility. Perhaps Hatch's arrest would indeed free people to form their own opinions about her and Jacob. It's done, Jacob said softly, taking her hand. Hatch is finished and we're still standing. Together, Martha agreed, squeezing his fingers. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The town bell began to ring, calling people to witness the end of an era. For the first time in years, Cedar Ridge would be free to choose its own future, and Martha Sullivan would be free to choose hers. The bronze bell in Cedar Ridge's church tower rang with urgent persistence, its deep voice carrying across the valley to summon the community to witness justice. The bell had called people to worship, warned of fires and celebrated victories, but never had its voice carried more significance than on this crisp October morning when the truth about William Hatch's crimes would finally be revealed. Martha stood in the doorway of her store, watching as people emerged from businesses and homes, drawn by the bell's insistent call. Word of Hatch's arrest was already spreading through the town like wildfire, carried by witnesses who had seen the federal deputies leading him away in chains. Now the community was gathering to learn the full scope of what had been happening in their midst. Jacob remained close beside her, his father's rifle no longer needed, but still within reach. The immediate physical danger had passed, but they both understood that the social and political aftermath of Hatch's exposure could be equally challenging. The man had wielded considerable influence in Cedar Ridge, and his removal would create a power vacuum that others might try to fill. "Look there," Jacob said quietly, nodding toward the crowd gathering in the town square. "Doc Henley's talking to the Morrison family. And there's Sheriff Bradley with the Thompsons." Martha followed his gaze and saw Doc Henley animated in conversation with several families, his hands gesturing as he explained the morning's events. The doctor had become their unofficial spokesman, using his respected position in the community to help people understand what Hatch's arrest meant for all of them. "Miss Sullivan?" a voice called from the street. Martha turned to see young Tommy Morrison approaching with his characteristic enthusiasm, his face bright with excitement and curiosity. "Is it true that Mr. Hatch was stealing people's land?" "Tommy," his mother called sharply, "don't bother Miss Sullivan with questions." "It's all right, Mrs. Morrison," Martha said, stepping down from her store to address the boy directly. "Yes, Tommy. It appears Mr. Hatch was using false documents to steal land from families throughout the valley." Tommy's eyes widened. "Like the paper I saw on his desk? The one that looked like the deed to your store?" Martha knelt to the boy's level, aware that their conversation was being observed by a growing circle of townspeople. "Exactly like that. Your sharp eyes and good memory helped expose his crimes. Tommy Morrison, you little hero," called out Mrs. Patterson, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Who would have thought that a boy delivering medicine would help catch a criminal?" The praise made Tommy blush, but it also served another purpose. It publicly acknowledged the role he had played in exposing Hatch's crimes, lending credibility to the accusations against such a powerful man. Deputy Marshal Harrison emerged from the sheriff's office, carrying a wooden crate filled with documents seized from Hatch's safe. His federal authority and obvious competence reassured the crowd that this wasn't merely a local dispute, but a serious matter being handled by proper authorities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison called out, his voice trained to carry over crowds, "I want to address the concerns I'm sure you all have about this morning's arrests." The crowd gradually quieted, though Martha could see suspicious glances directed her way from some quarters. Mrs. Hartwell stood with a cluster of women who clearly viewed the morning's events with skepticism, their expressions suggesting they blamed Martha for bringing trouble to their peaceful community. "William Hatch has been arrested on federal charges of land fraud, intimidation and conspiracy," Harrison continued. "The evidence against him includes forged documents, falsified surveys, and testimony from multiple victims across the territory. What about Miss Sullivan's role in all this?" Mrs. Hartwell called out, her voice sharp with accusation. "Seems convenient that she's the one who supposedly exposed him." Harrison's steady gaze fixed on Mrs. Hartwell. "Miss Sullivan's cooperation with our investigation was crucial, but she was not our only source of information. We've been tracking Mr. Hatch's activities for months, following reports from various locations." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward to support the marshal. "I can confirm that this investigation began long before any connection to Miss Sullivan's situation. We've documented at least 12 separate instances of fraud throughout the valley. 12 families," Doc Henley added, his voice heavy with emotion. 12 families driven from their homes by a man we trusted, a man who used our respect for authority to hide his crimes." Martha saw the mood of the crowd beginning to shift as the scope of Hatch's crimes became clear. These weren't abstract accusations. They were talking about people the community had known, families whose sudden departures now took on sinister new meaning. "The Hendersons," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly, understanding dawning in her voice. "Their barn fire, that wasn't an accident, was it?" "We believe it was arson, arranged to force them into financial distress," Harrison confirmed. "Mr. Hatch made an offer to buy their land the day after the fire." "And the Petersons' wells?" asked Mr. Davis, the blacksmith. "They swore someone had poisoned their water." "Deliberate contamination. Hatch wanted their land for access to the river." Each revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. These were people who had lived alongside the victims, who had accepted the convenient explanations for each family's misfortune, who had never imagined that one of their most prominent citizens could be capable of such calculated cruelty. "What happens now?" called out a voice from the back of the crowd. "Now Mr. Hatch faces trial in federal court," Harrison replied. "The evidence against him is substantial, and we expect conviction on multiple charges. As for his associates, Mr. Crawford is receiving medical treatment under guard, and Mr. Pike is cooperating with our investigation." "And the land he stole?" This question came from John Henderson, who had returned to town upon hearing news of Hatch's arrest. "What happens to the families who lost their homes?" Harrison exchanged glances with Sheriff Bradley before responding. "That's a matter for the courts to determine, but I can say that victims of fraud typically have strong legal grounds for recovering their property. The territorial government has procedures for addressing such situations." Martha felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Mrs. Thompson standing beside her. The older woman's face creased with worry and something that might have been shame. "Martha, dear," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My husband and we stopped shopping at your store because we were afraid of what Mr. Hatch might do if he thought we were supporting you." "You don't need to apologize," Martha replied gently. "You were protecting your family. But we were wrong to abandon a friend out of fear. And we were wrong to let that man control our choices through intimidation." Other voices began to speak up from the crowd, people admitting their own complicity in Hatch's reign of fear, their own choices to look the other way when neighbors suffered. The communal confession was painful but necessary, a recognition that Hatch's power had depended on their willingness to be intimidated. "The question is," Doc Henley said, raising his voice to address the entire crowd, "what kind of community do we want to be going forward? Do we want to return to the fear and division that allowed a man like Hatch to thrive, or do we want to build something better?" "Better," Tommy Morrison called out, his young voice clear and certain. "We should be better." His simple declaration seemed to galvanize the crowd. Martha saw nods of agreement, heard murmurs of approval, and for the first time in her adult life, felt the possibility that Cedar Ridge might truly become a place where she belonged. Jacob stepped closer to her side, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling emotions of the moment. "Whatever they decide," he said quietly, "we'll face it together." Martha reached for his hand, no longer caring who saw the gesture or what they thought of it. The bell continued to ring above them, its voice carrying their story to the mountains beyond, where the autumn wind caught it and scattered it like seeds across the wilderness, seeds of truth, justice, and the hope that love could indeed triumph over fear. As the crowd began to disperse from the town square, Martha felt a gentle touch on her arm. She turned to find Jacob holding something small and carefully wrapped in his large hands, a simple wedding ring he had carved from mountain oak during the long nights when he'd feared he might lose her to Hatch's schemes. "Martha," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying only to her ears despite the people still milling around them. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting, but I can't wait another moment to ask you something I should have asked weeks ago." Martha's heart began to race as Jacob slowly unwrapped the wooden ring, revealing the delicate craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Tiny wildflowers were carved around the band, mountain laurel, Indian paintbrush, and columbine, each one rendered with the same careful attention to detail she'd seen in the wooden bird he'd given her. "Jacob," she whispered, suddenly aware that several people had noticed what was happening and were watching with undisguised curiosity. "I love you." "Martha Sullivan," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger and more confident. "I love your strength, your kindness, your courage in the face of everything this town has thrown at you. I love the way you see beauty in simple things and the way you make even a rough mountain cabin feel like home." He dropped to one knee, right there in the dusty street, heedless of the growing audience. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal sent a ripple of shock through the remaining crowd. Martha heard gasps from some quarters, murmurs of approval from others, and from Mrs. Hartwell, a distinctly disapproving sniff. But all of that faded into background noise as she looked down into Jacob's earnest face and saw her entire future reflected in his dark eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, with growing confidence, "Yes, Jacob McKinnon, I will marry you." Jacob slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, where it fit perfectly. He had memorized the size of her hands during their weeks of courtship, planning for this moment even when their future seemed most uncertain. As he rose to his feet, Martha threw her arms around his neck, no longer caring about propriety or what the townspeople thought. The kiss they shared was tender but passionate, a seal on promises made, and a declaration that their love had survived its greatest test. When they finally separated, Martha was surprised to hear applause from several directions. "About time," called out Tommy Morrison, his young voice carrying clearly across the square. "I was wondering when you were going to ask her." His innocent commentary broke the tension, and several people laughed. Doc Henley approached with a broad smile, his medical bag still in hand from treating Crawford's wound. "Congratulations to you both," he said warmly, shaking Jacob's hand and kissing Martha's cheek. "This old town could use a good wedding to celebrate." "Indeed it could," agreed Mrs. Thompson, who had lingered to witness the proposal. "Martha, dear, you've waited long enough for happiness. I'm delighted to see you found it." Not everyone in the remaining crowd shared Mrs. Thompson's enthusiasm. Martha caught sight of Mrs. Hartwell's pinched expression and heard her muttered comment to her companion, "Shameless display," in public no less. But for every disapproving face, Martha saw 2 or 3 that reflected genuine pleasure at her engagement. The events of the morning had shifted something fundamental in the town's dynamics, and she realized that Hatch's removal had freed people to express feelings they'd kept hidden out of fear. Sheriff Bradley approached the couple with something that might have been fatherly approval. "McKinnon, you're getting a fine woman. Miss Sullivan, Martha, you're getting a man who proved today that he'll stand by you no matter what." "Thank you, Sheriff," Martha replied, still somewhat dazed by the rapid succession of events. "For everything you did to help us." "Just doing my job," Bradley replied, though his pleased expression suggested it had been more than mere duty. "Though I will say, watching Hatch get his comeuppance was one of the more satisfying moments of my career." Deputy Marshal Harrison joined their group, having finished securing the evidence from Hatch's office. "Congratulations on your engagement," he said formally. "I hope you'll both be very happy." "Thank you, Marshal," Jacob replied. "What happens next with Hatch?" "We transport him to Helena tomorrow for arraignment. The trial will likely take place in the spring, and we may need both of you to testify." Harrison's expression grew serious. "I should warn you that Hatch still has connections, and this case will attract attention throughout the territory. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Martha exchanged glances with Jacob, drawing strength from his steady presence. "We've faced worse scrutiny than anything the territorial courts can provide," she said firmly. "Good, because this case is going to be important, not just for the immediate victims, but as a precedent for how we handle land fraud throughout the frontier." Harrison adjusted his hat and prepared to leave. "Your courage in standing up to Hatch may help protect other communities from similar predators." As the marshal walked away, Martha felt the weight of that responsibility settling on her shoulders. Their personal battle with Hatch had become something larger, a symbol of resistance against the corruption and intimidation that plagued many frontier settlements. "No regrets?" Jacob asked quietly, following her thoughts with the intuition that came from genuine understanding. "None," Martha replied without hesitation, "though I suspect our wedding will be the subject of considerable discussion throughout the territory." "Let them talk," Jacob said with a slight smile. "We've given them something worth talking about." Doc Henley overheard the comment and chuckled. "Indeed you have. A romance that defeated corruption, exposed crime, and proved that love can triumph over prejudice. The newspapers will have a field day." Martha felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of their story spreading beyond Cedar Ridge, but Jacob's steady presence calmed her fears. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced Hatch, together with courage and determination. When will the wedding take place? Mrs. Thompson asked, her practical nature asserting itself. There will be planning to do, preparations to make. Martha looked at Jacob, realizing they hadn't discussed the practical details of their future. I suppose that depends on several factors, she said carefully. Spring, Jacob said firmly. After Hatch's trial is finished and we know where we stand legally. And after I've had time to expand the cabin to make it suitable for a married couple. The cabin? Martha asked, suddenly realizing they hadn't discussed where they would live after the wedding. Unless you'd prefer to stay in town, Jacob said quickly. I know the store is important to you, and I wouldn't want you to give up your independence. Martha considered the question seriously. The store represented everything she'd built for herself. Financial security, independence, a place in the community. But Jacob's cabin offered something she'd never had. A home where she was truly wanted, a place where her worth wasn't questioned or debated. Perhaps we could manage both, she said thoughtfully. Keep the store but live at the cabin. It would mean traveling back and forth, but it would mean the best of both worlds, Jacob finished, understanding immediately. Independence and togetherness, practical and romantic, Doc Henley approved. Though winter travel between the cabin and town will be challenging, we'll manage, Martha said with growing confidence. We've managed everything else. As the last of the crowd dispersed and normal life began to resume in Cedar Ridge, Martha stood with Jacob outside her store, the wooden ring warm on her finger and the future stretching ahead of them like an unmarked trail through beautiful, challenging country, Mrs. McKinnon, Jacob said experimentally, testing the sound of her new name. I like it, Martha replied, surprised by how naturally the name seemed to fit. Martha McKinnon. It has a strong sound. A strong name for a strong woman, Jacob agreed, pulling her close for another kiss as the October sun began its descent toward the western peaks. In the distance, the church bell gave one final celebratory ring, as if blessing their engagement and the new chapter beginning in Cedar Ridge. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning when the mountain wildflowers painted the high meadows in brilliant colors, Martha stood before the mirror in her small bedroom, adjusting the ivory silk dress that had once belonged to her mother. The tears in the fabric had been carefully mended with threads of silver, transforming the damage into something beautiful, much like her own journey from rejection to acceptance in Cedar Ridge. The wedding dress fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. Martha touched the silver locket at her throat, which now contained a new photograph, one of herself and Jacob taken during their engagement, their faces bright with the happiness that had sustained them through Hatch's trial and the slow transformation of their community. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her preparations. Come in, Martha called, turning from the mirror. Mrs. Thompson entered, carrying a bouquet of mountain wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, columbine, and mountain laurel, the same flowers Jacob had carved into her wooden engagement ring. From all of us, the older woman said with tears in her eyes. The women of Cedar Ridge wanted you to know that today you carry our blessings with you. Martha accepted the bouquet with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the gesture. The past 6 months had brought remarkable changes to the town. Hatch's conviction on federal charges had sent shockwaves throughout the territory, leading to investigations of similar fraud in other communities. More importantly for Cedar Ridge, his removal had allowed the town's better nature to emerge. Mrs. Thompson, Martha said softly, I never expected that we'd come to our senses. Mrs. Thompson smiled wryly. It took longer than it should have, dear, but sometimes it takes a crisis to show people what really matters. You and Jacob showed us what courage looks like, and that changed everything. Through her window, Martha could see people gathering in the church courtyard. The guest list had grown far beyond their original plans as more and more townspeople asked to attend. Even some of the families who had been driven away by Hatch's schemes had returned for the wedding, their legal battles largely resolved in their favor through the restitution process. Is Jacob ready? Martha asked, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Ready and pacing like a caged bear, Mrs. Thompson laughed. Doc Henley is with him, trying to keep him calm. I think the man who faced down Confederate cavalry is nervous about walking down the church aisle. Martha smiled at the image. She had learned so much about Jacob in the months since Hatch's arrest, not just about his past, but about his hopes for their future. He had spent the winter expanding his cabin, adding a room that would serve as an office for managing her store's affairs, and building a workshop where Martha could pursue the jewelry, making she'd always dreamed of attempting. "The new sign looks beautiful," Mrs. Thompson commented, nodding toward the store window visible from Martha's bedroom. McKinnon General Store was painted in elegant script across the glass, a symbol of the partnership that would define their marriage. Two lives joined but not subsumed, each bringing strength to the other. "Jacob insisted on keeping my name as well," Martha said. "Sullivan McKinnon General Store was too long for the window, but it will be on all the legal documents." A new knock announced Doc Henley's arrival. "Ladies, it's time," he said, with the authority of a man who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge and buried most of their grandparents. "The groom is threatening to storm the church if we delay much longer." Martha took a final look in the mirror, seeing not the woman who had been mocked and dismissed for so many years, but a bride about to marry the man who had chosen her above all others. The transformation was more than physical. Though she carried herself with new confidence, it was spiritual. The change that comes when someone realizes their own worth. The walk to the church took only a few minutes, but Martha felt as if she were traveling through her entire history with Cedar Ridge, past the hotel where she and Jacob had shared their first coffee, past the square where Hatch had been arrested, past the store where she had built her independence one transaction at a time. The church was fuller than Martha had ever seen it, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the courtyard. As she entered on Doc Henley's arm, he had insisted on the honor of giving her away. Conversations stopped and heads turned. But instead of the judgment and whispers she had endured for so many years, Martha saw smiling faces and tear-filled eyes. At the altar, Jacob waited in his finest clothes, his hair and beard neatly trimmed, but his eyes holding all the wildness and freedom of the mountains he loved. When he saw her walking toward him, his face lit up with a joy so pure it took Martha's breath away. Reverend Miller, who had arrived from Helena specifically to perform the ceremony, began the traditional words, but Martha barely heard them. Her attention was fixed on Jacob's face, on the gentle strength in his hands as they held hers, on the promise in his voice as he spoke his vows. "I, Jacob McKinnon, take you, Martha Sullivan, to be my wife," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you through whatever challenges life brings. I promise to see your strength even when you doubt it, to support your dreams even when they seem impossible, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life." When it was Martha's turn, she spoke with a confidence that surprised even her. "I, Martha Sullivan, take you, Jacob McKinnon, to be my husband. I promise to love you, support you, and build a life with you based on honesty, respect, and mutual devotion. I promise to be your partner in all things, your comfort in difficult times, and your companion on whatever adventures await us." The exchange of rings was particularly meaningful. Jacob slipped a band of gold onto Martha's finger, a more durable companion to the wooden engagement ring she would always treasure, while Martha placed a simple gold band on his finger, the first ring he had worn since the war. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," Reverend Miller pronounced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss they shared was gentle but passionate, a public declaration of the love that had sustained them through their trials. As they separated, the church erupted in applause and cheers that could be heard throughout Cedar Ridge. Outside the church, well-wishers surrounded them with congratulations and best wishes. Tommy Morrison, now 13 and taller than his mother, presented them with a hand-carved wooden box. "For your first home together," he said proudly. "I made it myself." Sheriff Bradley, resplendent in his dress uniform, shook Jacob's hand warmly. "You've got yourself a fine woman, McKinnon. Take good care of her." "I intend to," Jacob replied, his arms securely around Martha's waist. Even Mrs. Hartwell, who had remained one of the more reluctant converts to their cause, approached with grudging respect. "I may not have approved of your methods," she said stiffly, "but I can't argue with your results. You've brought this community together in ways I didn't think possible." As the celebration continued into the evening with dancing in the church hall and enough food to feed twice the number of guests, Martha found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The cruel words and social rejection that had once seemed insurmountable now felt like necessary preparation for appreciating the genuine acceptance she had finally found. "No regrets?" Jacob asked, as they shared a quiet moment on the church steps, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate their union. "Only one," Martha said, surprising him. "What's that?" "I regret that it took us so long to find each other." Jacob's smile was radiant. "Maybe we needed to become the people we are now before we could recognize what we had when we found it." As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave for their new life in the mountains, Martha was approached by a group of young women from the town. Sarah Peterson, the blacksmith's daughter, spoke for the group. "Mrs. McKinnon," she said formally, "we wanted to thank you for showing us that a woman doesn't have to accept what other people think she deserves. You fought for your happiness, and that gives us hope for our own futures." The gratitude in the young woman's voice moved Martha deeply. She realized that their story had become more than just a romance. It had become a symbol of the possibility that anyone, regardless of society's judgment, could find love and acceptance if they had the courage to demand it. "Remember," Martha told the young women, "your worth isn't determined by other people's limitations. It's determined by your own character, your own actions, and your own willingness to stand up for what you believe is right." As she and Jacob finally departed Cedar Ridge for their mountain home, Martha carried with her not just the memory of a perfect wedding day, but the knowledge that they had helped transform an entire community. The sign outside her store would continue to welcome customers, but now it represented something larger. Proof that love could indeed conquer prejudice, that courage could defeat corruption, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could become the heroes of their own stories. The mountain stars shone down on their wedding carriage as it wound its way up the familiar trail to Jacob's cabin, their cabin now, carrying them toward a future filled with the promise of shared mornings, quiet evenings, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something beautiful together in a harsh but magnificent world. Behind them, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the valley like earthbound stars, a community forever changed by the love story of a woman who had been told she wasn't worthy of love, and the mountain man who had seen past society's blindness to the truth of her heart.